She was young, brilliant, and fearless. She stood up to Hitler with nothing but paper, ink, and a conscience. This is the untold story of a girl who faced a regime with truth in her hands. This is the story of Sophie Scholl. It started in the calmest of places, Forchtenberg, a tiny town nestled between hills and whispers. The year was 1921, and Sophie Scholl had just entered a world that would soon be on fire. Sophie's early childhood seemed ordinary. She painted, played in the garden, and went to Lutheran Sunday school with her brothers and sisters. But this wasn't just any family. Her father, Robert Scholl, was the town's mayor, a man of strict values and quiet rebellion. He openly criticized Hitler before Hitler had even risen to full power. Sophie idolized her older brother Hans. He was confident, brilliant, and imaginative. Their home was filled with books, music, and intellectual debates. Their mother, Magdalena, a devout nurse and spiritual guide, often read them poetry and Bible verses before bed. There was a tenderness in that household, one built on thought, not blind obedience. Yet outside their door, Germany was unraveling. After the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles had shattered the country's pride. Inflation spiraled. Starvation whispered through neighborhoods. And fear of Bolshevism, of chaos, drove many toward a rising voice, a voice that promised order, strength, purity. That voice belonged to Adolf Hitler. By the time Sophie was 10, she was already in the League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel. At first, she was thrilled. Hiking trips, songs, uniforms. But slowly, a shadow crept in. Political indoctrination replaced fun. Racial purity replaced friendship. And unquestioning loyalty replaced thought. Her doubts began early. One day, her beloved art teacher, a Jewish man, vanished. No explanation. Just gone. She asked questions. The answers were silence. And Sophie Scholl, the curious little girl who once danced through gardens, started writing poems about truth, about beauty, and about how something wasn't right. By the time Sophie reached high school, the Nazi regime had its claws deep into German youth. But Sophie? She had begun to resist, quietly, in pencil, in thought. Her drawings became darker, her journal entries more philosophical. She devoured books that had been banned by the regime, works by Thomas Mann, Goethe, even Pascal. She wasn't looking for rebellion, she was looking for meaning. She saw her friends goose step and salute in school. She saw Jewish students quietly removed from classrooms. She saw how everyone looked away. Sophie didn't. But here's what few people know. She almost gave up. There was a time when she tried to blend in, to stop questioning, to be normal, because she was tired of being the odd one out, tired of having to hide her ideas in coded notebooks and whispered conversations. And then in 1940, her brother Hans was arrested, briefly, for being part of a forbidden youth group. That was the moment everything changed. From then on, Sophie knew silence was not an option. She enrolled at the University of Munich in 1942, bright-eyed, studying biology and philosophy, laughing with friends. But behind that laugh, there was steel, a decision, a purpose. She found others like her, and a name that would become both legend and warning: the White Rose. Long before leaflets fluttered from the university balconies, the seeds of rebellion were planted over quiet dinners and tense silences. The Scholl family wasn't like the others in Ulm. Robert Scholl, the father, openly called Hitler a scourge of God. He didn't care if the neighbors heard. He didn't care if the children repeated it at school. He wanted them to question. He believed silence was the deadliest form of betrayal. At the dinner table, they debated the morality of war. While others taught their children to salute, Robert taught his children to think. It was dangerous, and it worked. Hans Scholl, Sophie's older brother once marched proudly in the Hitler Youth. He had worn the uniform, sung the songs, believed in the cause. But even he began to turn. When Hans discovered the Nazis' lies about Jews, about war, about honor, he withdrew. First in frustration, then in shame. Sophie watched her brother's awakening. She read the banned books he smuggled in. She copied quotes into her journal. She started asking her teachers impossible questions. Why are we not allowed to read Heinrich Heine? Why did my Jewish friend vanish last semester? If we are the superior race, why do we need to silence everyone else? The teachers had no answers, but Sophie had begun to collect her own. What most don't realize is how much of Sophie's fire came not from politics, but from faith. Her mother had raised her with a deep sense of spiritual conscience. She wasn't a radical. She was moral. That distinction mattered. Because when Sophie began to resist, she didn't see herself as a hero. She saw herself as a human being doing what any decent person should do. You wouldn't have noticed it at first. Just a phrase here, a gesture there, a refusal to chant. By 1939, the Scholl household was under quiet surveillance. Robert had been arrested for a critical comment about Hitler. The children were labeled as politically unreliable. But still, they pushed boundaries, subtly, deliberately. Sophie, still in her teens, submitted a sketch of a woman holding a broken swastika as part of a school art assignment. It was confiscated. She was questioned. She smiled and said, "It was just abstract." That same year, she began secretly corresponding with dissident students across Germany through coded letters, carefully phrased to avoid detection. One of the most profound, yet rarely discussed, turning points came after a school biology lesson. The class had been taught the Nazi racial theories, charts, skull measurements, the superiority of the Aryan genome. Sophie stood up and asked, "If these theories are so correct, why do we need to punish those who disagree?" The room fell silent. She was reported. Again. But that question, so simple, so dangerous, would become the essence of her future resistance. Because what terrified the regime most wasn't violence. It was the idea that someone could say, "This is wrong." By the time Sophie entered university, she no longer wondered if she should resist. She only wondered how. Munich smelled like intellect and danger. It was a city of universities and operas, and also of SS headquarters and silent fear. When Sophie Scholl arrived at the University of Munich in May 1942, the war had already swallowed Europe whole. The world outside was burning, but on campus, the silence was deafening. Students studied, professors lectured, but behind every book and every polite smile was the cold breath of surveillance. Sophie enrolled to study biology and philosophy. She loved learning. She loved asking questions. But most of all, she wanted to understand how a country could lose its soul and how she might help it find it again. Waiting for her in those halls was someone familiar, Hans Scholl. Her older brother had already begun living a dangerous double life. By day, a medical student. By night, something far more subversive. He had gathered a small group of students who shared a belief that the Nazi regime wasn't just wrong, it was evil. They didn't carry weapons. They carried words. Hans introduced Sophie to his friends. Alexander Schmorell, a fellow medical student with Russian roots and a burning conscience. Willy Graf, deeply religious and quiet, but with a moral fire that could not be extinguished. And later, Professor Kurt Huber, a philosopher whose lectures still dared to challenge blind obedience. These weren't radicals, they were thinkers, dreamers, and together they would become the authors of something that hadn't been seen in Hitler's Germany: pure, printed resistance. The name was delicate, like a whisper. The White Rose. But its message? Sharp enough to pierce a dictatorship. The plan was simple and almost suicidal. Hans, Sophie, and a small circle of friends, Alexander Schmarell, Willy Graf, Christoph Probst, and eventually Professor Kurt Huber, decided they would print anti-Nazi leaflets. No slogans, no graffiti, just truth. On paper. They typed them late at night using an old duplicating machine. They used pseudonyms, switched apartments, wore gloves. They mailed the leaflets in bulk, hundreds at a time, addressed to professors, students, random households. The idea was to flood minds with questions. The first leaflet read, "Nothing is so unworthy of a civilized nation as allowing itself to be governed without opposition by an irresponsible clique that has yielded to base instinct." They wrote of the atrocities on the Eastern Front, of the mass shootings, of the gassing of Jews. And here's something people rarely realize. They knew. At a time when many Germans claimed ignorance, Sophie and her circle had already uncovered the genocide, and they chose to speak it. Sophie, with her fierce handwriting and soft voice, helped refine the wording, making it both poetic and cutting. What drove her wasn't politics, it was conscience. She once said, "Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare express it as we did." But the Gestapo was already watching. The paper, the ink, the fingerprints, every word they wrote was a step closer to death. The war was everywhere, on the radio, in the food lines, in the telegrams announcing deaths. But inside the University of Munich, something else was spreading. Paper. The White Rose began printing more leaflets, each one more daring than the last. They didn't shout, they didn't insult. They simply asked questions the regime couldn't afford to answer. Why do we allow this slaughter to continue? Where is our outrage? Are we still human if we stay silent? Each leaflet opened like a wound, and with each delivery, the group grew bolder. They left them in mailboxes. They snuck them into phone booths. They stuffed them into textbooks in the library. And something remarkable started to happen. People began whispering again. Not loudly, never loudly, but in dorm rooms, in basements, in churches. Some nodded, some cried, some stayed quiet, terrified. But they read. They read every word. What many don't know is that Sophie played a critical role in distribution. She wasn't just a supporter, she was the strategist. She helped identify post offices where packages wouldn't be traced. She organized routes, times, safe houses. And she insisted that the language of the leaflets be direct, but never hateful. She wanted hearts to stir, not burn. "We are your conscience," she once told a friend. And consciences don't need to scream. They just need to be heard. But with every delivery, the Gestapo's net grew tighter. They had fingerprints, witnesses, names. The group knew the risks, but none of them stepped back. Especially not Sophie. They didn't need to see the Gestapo to feel them. The university halls grew colder. Professors stopped looking students in the eye. Footsteps echoed longer. Doors creaked slower. Even the clocks seemed to tick more cautiously. And yet, the White Rose pressed on. They had printed 6 leaflets. But that wasn't enough. Hans and Sophie wanted more. They wanted visibility, urgency. They wanted everyone to hear the truth, even if it meant standing in the open. So on February 18, 1943, they did the unthinkable. They walked into the university carrying a suitcase and a satchel filled with thousands of leaflets. Leaflet 6. It was their most powerful message yet. It called on Germans to rise up, to sabotage, to resist. It condemned Hitler by name. It detailed war crimes, and it ended with a line that still burns. "We are your bad conscience. The White Rose will not leave you in peace." They placed the leaflets in empty lecture halls, on benches, in stairwells, anywhere a student might pause and read. And then, Sophie saw the top-floor balcony. There were still so many leaflets in her bag, too many to leave behind, too many to go to waste. So she walked to the railing, took a breath, and let them fly. 1,000 truths rained down into the atrium like paper snow. Whispers became wind. The silence cracked. But on the floor below, a janitor looked up. His name was Jacob Schmid, a loyal Nazi. He ran. He shouted. He called for the police. Sophie and Hans were arrested minutes later, still inside the university, still holding the truth in their hands. What few people know is this: the final copy of Leaflet 6 never made it into circulation. It was found folded in Sophie's coat pocket, slightly smudged, but intact. She never threw it away. She held on to it like a promise. Because sometimes, all it takes is one voice in the silence to make the whole world listen. They didn't scream. They didn't cry. Not even when the steel doors slammed shut behind them. Sophie and Hans were taken to the Gestapo headquarters that same afternoon. No chance to run, no phone call, no lawyer, just concrete walls, cold metal chairs, and silence. But the leaflets were already evidence enough. And Sophie? She didn't deny a thing. "Yes, I was involved," she told the interrogator. "And I'm proud of it." The officer stared at her, confused. She was only 21, a girl with soft hands and a quiet voice. But she was steel. They questioned her for hours, day and night. They told her that her friends had already confessed. They lied. She didn't break. One of the Gestapo officers, Robert Moore, actually began to waver. Behind closed doors, he begged her, "If you just sign a statement blaming your brother, you might live." But she looked him straight in the eye and said, "I won't betray him. I won't betray myself." What most people don't know is that during her arrest, Sophie even asked the guards if they believed in what they were doing. She turned the questions back on them. She made them squirm, because she wasn't just resisting. She was forcing others to confront their own silence. 3 days. That's all the Nazis gave her. In those 72 hours, Sophie was denied any public trial, legal defense, or chance to speak freely. But she wrote. And what she wrote was extraordinary. In a final letter to her parents, she didn't beg or cry. She simply said, "We will see each other again. Until then, don't forget that we did what we had to do. Conscience is above law." She asked for her Bible. She read Psalms aloud in her cell. And on the morning of February 22nd, 1943, she was allowed one last visit with her parents. Her mother held her tight, weeping. Her father whispered, "Sophie, you've done everything right. I'm so proud of you." Then Sophie was led away. No crowd, no mercy, just a wooden guillotine in the basement of Stadelheim prison. She walked to it without resistance, and before the blade fell, she spoke her final words. "Such a fine sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter, if through us, thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" She was 21, and she died standing taller than the regime that tried to silence her. There was no jury, no deliberation, only a sentence that had already been written. On February 22nd, 1943, just 4 days after their arrest, Sophie, Hans, and Christoph Probst were brought before the People's Court. But the term was a farce. Presiding was Judge Roland Freisler, Hitler's hand-picked executioner in robes. He didn't listen. He ranted, he screamed, pounded the desk, spit venom with every word. He called Sophie a corrupting influence, a traitor, a shameless intellectual. But Sophie never flinched. When asked if she regretted her actions, she calmly replied, "If you and your fellow judges are not touched by what we wrote, then I feel sorry for you." There was no real trial. Within minutes, the sentence was read, "Death, all three, by guillotine, that same day. What most people don't know is that Sophie's composure in the courtroom deeply unsettled even the guards. One would later admit he had never seen anyone face death with such clarity, such peace. But Sophie's defiance didn't end there. As she was led from the courtroom, she turned to the judge and said, "You may hang us today, but tomorrow, your heads will fall too." The blade fell 3 times that day, but the echo never stopped. The same evening, the bodies of Sophie, Hans, and Christoph were buried in the Perlock Cemetery under the watch of armed guards. Their graves were marked simply. No ceremony, no hymns, just silence. But the leaflets, they didn't die. Unknown to the Nazis, one of the final White Rose leaflets had been smuggled out of Germany. It reached Allied forces, and in July 1943, it was reprinted by the Royal Air Force, millions of copies dropped over German cities. It now carried a new title, the Manifesto of the Students of Munich. The resistance they sparked wasn't a revolution, it didn't overthrow a regime, but it planted something deeper, a memory, a truth, a challenge. Today, schools, streets, and statues across Germany bear Sophie Scholl's name. Her face is printed on stamps. Her words are quoted in classrooms. But more than that, her courage became a standard, not just for Germany, for anyone, anywhere who chooses conscience over compliance. And perhaps that's what makes her legacy so enduring. Because Sophie Scholl didn't die as a hero. She died as a student, a daughter, a friend, who simply chose to say, "This is wrong." And sometimes that's all it takes. Her voice was silenced by a blade, but her courage still echoes. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe to Execution Detective, where we uncover the brave, the forgotten, and the forbidden. History remembers those who refuse to be silent.